let's maybe pivot a little bit while still sticking with Gotham, because while O'Hara was the main free agency kind of combo breaker at the November 15th deadline, what we ended up seeing out of every club, all 12 teams making their offseason roster statuses. So we saw all 12 clubs drop, each of their current rosters in form. We saw some clubs have very few players listed across their current roster shape, and then we saw some clubs with hefty amounts of numbers of players on those teams. And within each of these announcements, there were common threads, right, across all of them, all 12 clubs, listing players who were in place and in contract for the future in 2023 and beyond. But we also saw within some of these announcements that there were players who were waived, that there were current contract options that were extended to certain players, that there are still some ongoing negotiations with players who happen to still be free agents on, listed on that free agency list. So within all 12 of the clubs, we saw some of those common threads throughout them. So maybe let's take a look at some of the things that surprised us across the 12 team announcements. Maybe let's stick with Gotham. Obviously, O'Hara, the news of O'Hara coming that night after they solidified most of their roster going into this offseason. I thought it was pretty cool that in sort of having somebody like O'Hara, announced as someone who's likely going to be playing within the outside back position. They also extended offers to somebody like Sabrina Flores, who has typically been utilized in that outside back position as well. Paige Monahan also got a new offer. The club also exercised 2023 contract options for Taryn Torres, Ellie Jean, Kellyanne Livingstone, hence the handcuff. And they specifically noted how McCall Zerboni and Estelle Johnson are out of contract officially now with the club and are listed as free agents. So I think that's what we're alluding to a little bit. We're just like Kelly O'Hara just sort of felt like the first and or possibly second piece to this offseason puzzle that Gotham is currently putting together. In terms of, the other 11 teams, though, who had to also drop some roster decisions in the offseason here. Was there any other team that kind of stood out to you that made you raise your eyebrow a little bit, Lisa, and say, what are they doing here?
I think looking at a team like Washington Spirit announcing their roster, I mean, we know the big loss of Kelly O'Hara, her going to Gotham, but also 7 other players were not returning for the 2023 season. I think it was just a little bit interesting to me to kind of look at that and dive into that, because this is a Washington Spirit side that also needs to revamp from last year, right? You go from winning the league in 2021 to not even competing for a chance in the playoffs at the end of the 2022 season. So there needs to be a lot of change happening there. Washington also doesn't have a head coach at this point, right? They're one of, I think, 3 teams in the league right now, along with Orlando Pride and Houston Dash, that are still in search of a head coach. So that also possibly changes things. But when Washington Spirit announced their offseason roster, there were 7 players that left. Devin Kerr, goalkeeper, being one of the big ones that played every time Aubrey Kingsbury was not available this year. She played every single game that Kingsbury wasn't there. So I think that's pretty interesting that now they just lost their backup goalkeeper in Kerr. And Aubrey Kingsbury is a player that has been in and out of U.S. national team camps. Yeah. And heading into a World Cup year, yes, Kingsbury did not get called into the most recent camp in November when the United States played against Germany, but we don't know what that's going to look like moving forward, because Kingsbury has been consistently called in. The January camp, the United States is heading to New Zealand. It's often we see a big chunk of players going to that January camp. And if Kingsbury is a player that wants to try to get on that World Cup roster, and I imagine she is, she's going to be working really hard to get back in there. And in a World Cup year, you need backup goalkeepers. You need backup players, because teams are going to be losing them, especially a team like Washington that has historically had 6, 7 players gone missing during international windows. So now without Kelly Herrera, that changes things a little bit. But I was just really shocked to see that they let go of Devin Kerr, who's your solid number 2 goalkeeper at Washington.
Yeah, I'm with you. I mean, 7's a big number to say, hey, we are waiving X amount of players from this franchise. But within that, again, talking about options that they have extended to players like Sam Staub, Jordan Baggett, Dorian Bailey, Bailey Feist, Anna Hefferty, Maddie Elwell, Tara McKeown. These are players that we saw in light of an incredibly difficult season for this Washington Spirit side in 2022, who were regular featured players, right? These are players that they're saying, okay, we're moving forward with you all because we see that you have sort of, participated in multiple matches. And, these are players who, some of them were part of that 2021 championship winning team. So I think it's jarring when you sort of see the the lack of players currently in place, when you see a big number of players who won't be returning with the club. I think any offseason in that aspect is always a little bit jarring, where you're just kind of like, like there's going to be a ton of players here who actually receive some tough news, that they're released or waived or are not going to be part or returning back to a club that they may have had some time with. Gabby Vincent was one of those players for me with the Spirit. I thought maybe there would be a chance here for this player to see some
Taylor
more.
Ulmer too.
Yeah.
I think Taylor Ulmer was a player that had a lot of consistent minutes in the midfield for this Washington side. Starting like Karina Rodriguez, there were a number of players that got minutes that are now no longer with Washington. And then you look at the free agents, Nicole Barnhart, another goalkeeper. So they're down to one goalkeeper, and Aubrey Kingsbury. Amber Brooks and Tori Huster also free agents. So where they'll move and where they'll end up is big. I think looking at the free agents that haven't re-signed with their clubs yet is also something that I'm like keeping an eye on. I mean, you have to look at OL Reign. They've got 4 free agents that are instrumental in how OL Reign and Laura Harvey plays, with Lauren Barnes, Nikki Stanton, Tobin Heath, and Megan Rapinoe. OL Reign has said that they're in works and conversations with these players about returning, but there hasn't been an update yet about Barnes, Heath, Rapinoe, and Stanton. So those are other players. I'm like, hey, what's happening? Davinia, we've got no word on Davinia yet. What's happening?
Yeah. No, I mean, look, we don't have an official word on Davinia right now, but let's pivot to North Carolina then in that aspect, because this is a team, in their initial offseason moves made it a point to say within the release that Davinia is one of these players, yes, who is a free agent, but they are hoping to bring back, and currently within ongoing negotiations with this player. We cracked a couple jokes about it, on the previous episode this week on Tuesday, that, if there are ongoing negotiations with somebody like Davinia, perhaps they're on pause right now because it's an international window and she's not even in the United States, to sort of have those conversations was competing against Canada while, competing with Brazil. So, again, we have Davinia on our free agency board as the biggest targets of the off season. But I think when you're a franchise and you have to announce your initial off season roster in light of a new free agency period, the first time there's ever been a free agency period in the NWSL, that is something that you want to make a note of in your release. That's going to be seen not only by the public, but specifically by your club's supporters and their fans. You want to obviously say that you are making an attempt, that you are making an effort to try to get back one of the top players in the world right now. But within that as well, they also announced that they picked up 7 players, in terms of making their return. Marissa Bova, Emily Gray, a lot of their young talents that they had targeted, that they're going to try to bring back and return to the Courage. So I'm excited. I was excited to see Fukunagano on there as well. Obviously, Diana Ordonez. You want to see all these young players that they sort of came, that they carried through the previous off season as part of their future plans, and we saw, a number of those names within the initial roster moves here. But curious how some of the kind of in limbo statuses are right now. There's Casey Murphy, Caitlin Rowland, Ryan Williams, Binya, obviously Brianna Pinto, Meredith Speck, Brittany Ratcliffe. They're out of contract, but those were players that they specifically wanted to know that negotiations are ongoing. So I don't know if there was anything within the Courage that was necessarily shocking, but it's a work in progress. We didn't get a full answer, but we definitely have a work in progress status from the Courage for sure.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of moving parts on all ends. I think every team dropped their roster at this point. So anyone that's curious as to who's on their team that they're cheering, who's having, go check that out. I think one of another big surprises was Gemma Bonner and Racing Louisville. They decided to go separate ways, declining the option so that Bonner could play closer to home. She's from England, so imagine we'll see her kind of head back that way. Another team, Houston Dash, I think we should touch on and chat about, because this is a player that only has 12 players rostered at this point for Houston, and their free agents, Elizabeth Eddy, Kelly Ferguson. There's a lot happening there. What are your thoughts on Houston?
I was really curious to when Houston dropped their initial offseason roster, because this was one of those teams that we were talking about, that I thought was going to really try and solidify some things in the offseason, because we saw once the Dash got eliminated from the postseason, one of the first things they did was make sure that they re-signed Sophie Schmidt, and they signed that player to a multi-year deal. We're talking 2 years with the Dash, and Alyssa Chapman as well. So they said, hey, these are a couple of players that we want to make sure that we get to sign on the line and ensure that they're with us for the remainder of the following seasons. And so when this got dropped, I was a little, I don't want to say like underwhelmed, but it just sort of felt like, hey, these are the players that the team is going to move forward with at this moment. I would imagine that it's hard or difficult to sort of retain certain players or try to make or carry ongoing negotiations when you don't have a head coach right now. I would imagine that that's a little bit difficult. But Valerie Galvin was someone who I thought maybe they might try to retain, because this was a player that they acquired mid to late season. And I think if you do that, maybe there's some intention behind it, and that you're going to try to retain a player like that. But perhaps that they, now that they're not bringing her back, perhaps that was like a little bit of a high risk, high reward. They're like, hey, maybe we're going to take on this contract for now, and hopefully this will pay off for us as we continue to, try to make this march to the postseason. But they're not bringing back the French international on a contract option. But you mentioning, Elizabeth Eddy, Carly Farkinson, right? Free agents. But, Brie Vasali, one of these players who, they've decided that they're not, hey, thank you for your service. We're not going to bring you back for 2023. I just sort of feel like we blinked, and now Brie Vasali has been like rotated out of a Dash roster where maybe at one point was viewed as a part of a younger core of players that this franchise was going to try to build a little bit around. And so, obviously Vizzali, part of that 2020 Challenge Cup victory with Houston Dash. And now, we're gonna have to see if she's going to be picked up by another team, or if maybe, she has ties back to Europe. This was a player who initially was drafted in NWSL but went overseas. So we'll see. I'm curious if there's a team out there that is looking to add some midfield depth, perhaps, and maybe they look at a player like Brie Vasali. But I don't know if we're gonna get any additional moves from this Houston Dash side in this kind of near off-season window. I'm curious if maybe the next round of moves that we see for the Dash might be closer to and or around the draft. Because like I said, it's tough to perhaps try to throw a pitch to a player in terms of recruiting or luring them into your organization when you don't have a head coach in place, right? So I'm gonna keep an eye on that for sure.
Yeah, I think the teams that are all looking for head coaches, it's going to be a little interesting. I think Houston's a team I'm definitely keeping an eye on as to who's going to be their head coach and what players they're going to acquire, what spots they need to fill, who they might go after in the draft, what college players they might look to acquire. I think Orlando's another team that I'm really keeping an eye on. They've got to get a coach and they've got to turn things around. They went through a bit of turmoil last year as well. They had some good bright spots and bright moments. I think Seb Hines coming in as the interim head coach helped that Orlando side, but how do they move forward? How do they take a step forward from the trenches that they've been stuck in a little bit? You look at the roster and the players that they have on their team with Marta, they've got Maggie Doherty Howard, they've got big names, right? They've got players that can do things, but it's putting all those pieces together. I think as we approach this offseason and continue to move forwards and through it, there are teams that I'm keeping my eye on. It's Orlando. It's Gotham. What else are they going to acquire? Who else is going to come to Gotham and Houston? That's a big one for me. Angel City a little bit too. Where is their depth going to come from? Because they didn't have a lot of depth last year. Freya Kuhn did not use a lot of depth at Angel City. So are they going to make their team a little bit deeper, have a little bit more versatility, have more weapons coming in off their bench that they play with? Those are big teams. And then, Chicago. What's happening there? There's a lot of question marks still around the Chicago side.
Yeah, for sure. I think, it's funny in terms of watching or sort of looking side by side of all the 12 teams that have sort of put out their end of season roster moves. You look at Chicago and they've got the most. They're one of the teams with the most players listed in their initial off-season move. So I think Angel City might be carrying around 20 or 20 something on the rosters, and I think Chicago's got a full 18 that is like solidified at this moment. I think they kind of we're already sort of painting the picture, I think, for their team into this offseason, making the announcement that they re-signed Yuki Nagasato through 2023. One of their free agency announcements was that they have reached an agreement with Aaron Wright, and these were two players that were listed on their free agency list, and they were 2 of 7, so there's still a hefty handful of players that they are going to try to negotiate with. And similarly to some of the other teams making those roster announcements, that they are also trying to renegotiate things with the free agents to try to bring those players back. So whether it's Vanessa DiBernardo or Kalia Watt, Danny Colaprico, Morgan Gautrat, et cetera, that they're going to try to retain those players so that they're interested in having those negotiations end with them signing in Chicago. But I think having 2 so far off of that free agency list, I think, is big for this Red Stars team. And the fact that they obviously are still going to continue building with players that are familiar to and with this franchise, whether it's somebody like an Alyssa Nair or a Mallory Pugh. But I think that's what folks are going to try to take a look at. I would anticipate that that this is a team that will try to make their efforts to sign and get some of those free agents to resign back with the club. But I don't know how you get all of them. I think that will be a real kind of breakout storyline if somehow Chicago finds themselves in a way to retain every single one of those free agents. I think it'll be incredibly hard, because I think when you look at some of the talent that is available there, that some other clubs are gonna, want to try to make some offers as well. I mentioned how, Colaprico might be one of these players that could be targeted by other clubs, plural, that this is a midfielder that would instantly sort of solve a lot of problems, I think, for a lot of clubs out there. I mean, listening to some of the clubs that you mentioned, we are absolutely keeping an eye on some of those teams who found themselves in that second lower half of the table, right? Like, what are those clubs going to do to try to ensure that they are in the playoff picture conversation in 2023? And I think you're looking at Chicago and a whole ton of their free agents and saying, hey, you're getting experienced players who have at least 6 years experience in the league. And not only that, there are players on this roster who have incredible playoff experience as well. So I wouldn't be surprised if those players are fielding different offers. And I think if somehow Chicago even retains, at least, 2 to 3 of the potential 5 remaining, that's going to be a big storyline itself. But it's we'll see. The next episode we might be talking about how one of them signed elsewhere.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot still to come. I mean, this was a little bit of a roundup, but more trades will be happening. There's a lot of free agents that still have to sign. Where those moves are going to end up, or we have a head coach watch going, a trade watch going. Sandra, plug your article. You've got NWSL Trade Tracker on CBSSports.com. You can go check it out there for Sandra. There's a lot still happening. We got the Men's World Cup coming up, and we're here to chat all about it for a long time.
And we're diligently waiting. We're on Dabinia watch. So, obviously if something happens there, we can't wait to hop on and chat about it with everyone. Free agency is here. The off season is in full swing. Thank you all so much for listening to Attacking Third. We're going to keep you posted as things develop.